The magic of Doctor Who is nothing is what it appears to be. The police box is not a police box. The Doctor is not an old human being. Susan is not a school child. Running through Doctor Who is the thing is, look at life. There's more to life than you think. Life is not straightforward. To get the most out of life, you need to dig a bit deeper. So I think that's part of the magic of it.
Time for Type 40, your Doctor Who podcast from the Spacebook for the Fandom Podcast Network, with me, Dan Hadley, Birmingham's king of the geeks, and your designated driver, materialising again here with unbeatable Doctor Who conversation on our free speaking, big thinking show for everyone. Whatever decade or century you started watching, reading, or listening along to the ongoing adventures of our hero, Doctor Who. We talk about it all on this show, and now celebrating the series' 60th anniversary season. Come and step into our TARDIS, join the party on Type 40. Yes, happy Diamond anniversary, friends, fellow fans. You've come to the right place here to scratch that itch for all space and time talk. Even better news is you don't just have to listen to me. I've got Sarah Graham and Simon Horton here too. All hands on deck, everybody. Good to see you.
Greetings all, greetings. Lovely to be here.
Here we are at last, Simon in TARDIS blue.
Absolutely. I can't imagine why I'm wearing TARDIS blue today, but it's appropriate.
And at the anniversary season at last, Sarah, it's been such a long time coming.
It has, yeah. We're finally there. We're in the final furlong, but yeah, so excited.
It's both exhausting and exciting at the same time. Luckily, the TARDIS, the desktop theme, our chosen model this time, does have a few chairs and things we can throw ourselves down on, at least somewhere to hang your cardie up, eh?
Yeah, very good. I love this interior.
Yeah, the original and the best in many ways.
But we have to make extra room for a gentleman. Our guest on this edition of the show. This is someone with a depth of knowledge on this particular facet of the world's longest running best loved sci-fi and fantasy TV show. I think it's probably unrivaled. We could keep him going for hours and hours and hours. So we're going to see how long and how deep we managed to get into it all with our guest on this show, TARDIS expert. We're joined by Tony Farrell here. So where is he? Let's grab him. Let's time scoop him up. Here he is.
Hey,
Yay, he's here.
welcome,
Hi, Tony.
Hiya all. Hiya.
Welcome to Type 40, my friend. So here you are in the console room, home from home. Was this a bit of a boyhood dream come true there?
Oh, definitely. I've been watching Doctor Who, as long as I can remember. I think the first story that I can recall with any clarity is Power of the Daleks, the scene where the colonist fits the Daleks' gun back in. That's stuck in my memory since all the way back to 1966.
Wow.
Before that, I think I've got vague memories of the chase. The reason I say that is I remember the Daleks, again, blowing up this white, gleaming city, stood on top of these metal columns. And many years later, I think I caught a clip of it on Blue Peter or something like that. And I realised that's what I remember from being a 3.5-year-old. So the old saying, give me the boy till he's 7 and I'll show you the man, is very, very true in my case. Doctor Who got me hook, line and sinker as a 3-year-old. And 60 years later, I'm still here with it now.
brilliant. Quite
Fabulous stuff. When you hear stories like that, Simon, well, you could hear a pin drop. As soon as Tony started talking, when he mentioned Power of the Daleks, I said, what?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because there aren't that many people out there who can remember Power of the Daleks. I wish I could. I can't. I wasn't around. So,
Well, millions of people watch the thing, but of course, some viewers, and there's plenty of people who did watch it who are still with us, still very healthy, and it's not particularly ancient. Don't get us wrong, Tony, but not everybody takes it all in the way that those minds, Sarah, that this series appeals to do they? Not everybody watches TV like that.
No, they don't. But there is just something unique about Doctor Who and unique to the kind of fans that it does appeal to. These sci-fi fans, we just soak it up like a sponge. And I'm so envious, Tony. I wish I had these memories. I'm envious of all of you.
You won't be envious of the aching back and the aching knees.
Aching backs, aching knees. Yeah, I think you probably need a ride, Tony, because all heroes need a ride, don't they? That can't be argued. And a lot of the most culturally sort of impactful figures tend to have them, don't they, in one form or another. So the Lone Ranger, he had Silver, hadn't he? And Michael Knight had Kit, the talking car. Captain Kirk was there on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, and Batman had his Batmobile, and they were powered by everything from dilithium crystals to plain horsepower. And I don't really view the Doctor and his TARDIS as any different at all. We make no apologies here on Type 40 for focusing on our Doctors and the actors who've played them throughout our Diamond Anniversary season of coverage here. However, it's the TARDIS's 60th birthday too, and we'd never want to appear to take the old girl for granted. So it was the Doctor in the TARDIS to 80s kids. It was inseparable, and to children of the sort of Netflix generation, he was the madman with a box, wasn't he? The box. They were inseparable, mostly for the entire length and breadth of both productions of the series. The Doctor, the Doctor's wife, and now and again, Simon, she's changed her appearance almost as many times as the Doctor. It's maybe the odd dye job or a couple of inches off here and there from the roof or the feet. But generally speaking, the TARDIS has cast the same shadow, hasn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely has. I mean, purists are always going to struggle to kind of explain within Doctor Who terms why the TARDIS keeps regenerating. The TARDIS does keep changing minor details endlessly. You always got a different TARDIS, but as you say, the silhouette is always the same. It always casts the same shadow. It's always the same shape. And I've spoken at length about this before, that I just think it's just, I don't know why, it's just a very, very romantic image somehow. I don't know what it is about that design. I know that obviously over the years it's grown in our estimation, because it's taken on all the connotations that go with it because of its association with Doctor Who. But even before, without that, it's just a beautiful design. It's just the proportions of it. It's the design of it. It's the way it's constructed. I've talked about before how it's just the shape of the panels and the way the light falls on it and the shadows that are cast by the panels, and it's those windows. It's just a perfect, beautiful design. Hats off to whoever came up with it to begin with. It's just magnificent. It's an icon. It's a classic.
Obviously, outwardly, it still looks like an old police box. They were once common enough on British streets. We're assured. Tony, do you remember police boxes on the street corners?
The first trip I ever made to London, my dad, my mother and my nan and I went down. I must have been about 4, maybe 5. So we're looking at 1965, 1966. We travelled down overnight by car. Believe it or believe it not, and at that stage in this country's history, we didn't have such a thing as the M1.
Wow.
So it was all A roads to get down there. So whereas today you could get down in 3 hours drive from where I am. As I say, then it was an overnight journey. So we camped halfway. And my abiding memory is going over Chelsea Bridge. And guess what was at the end of Chelsea Bridge? The familiar blue box. And
really?
Just as we were driving past, the door opens and out steps a policeman.
Brilliant. And you'd obviously already fallen in love with you'd presumably fallen in love with Doctor Who by that point anyway. So that you were excited to see, because it was TARDIS. Yeah,
another of these childhood memories that sort of best part of 60 years that's vivid, as clear as a bell.
But do you remember the TARDIS in specifically? Do you remember sort of getting obsessed by the TARDIS at any point?
I think it all happened at the same time, Simon. Doctor Who grabbed me, and it's put its claws into me to this very day.
Still grabbing people now.
Ever since I was 4 or 5, drawing pictures of the TARDIS, drawing pictures of the Daleks, drawing pictures of the control room, the TARDIS console room.
I tell you what, Tony, I remember making my very first TARDIS that I made. I made out of, do you remember those packets of tea that you used to get? Those little, they don't do them now, but sort of PG tips. They used to come in a little box that was the perfect proportions of a TARDIS. I'm not kidding you. And I remember covering this PG tips or whatever it was. Probably was. There probably only was PG tips in those days, or Sainsbury's Red Label, and just covering it with paper and drawing on my first TARDIS.
Yeah, exactly so. My experience the same. Doodles, drawing Doctor Who.
Brilliant. Whether it is the outsides or the insides of the TARDIS, the magic is definitely still there, even decades since the last police box was last seen on British streets, or last one that was in service. Maybe there are some still dotted around here and there that are kind of cafes or little vape shops or even nail bars, I understand. But mostly a police box, Sarah, is a TARDIS, isn't it? And as I say, although there aren't police boxes in service, whenever we see Doctor Who out on the street being filmed in a British city, and you see that box, any version of that box, on a street corner being lit, or with actors or crew hanging around it, there is some indefinable magic just about that alone, as if all is right with the world, if Doctor Who is out being filmed somewhere at the moment.
It is, and you just have to stop and take it all in. It is, and like you say, there's just something so right about it. Like it belongs there. It has to be there. And if the world would be a sadder place if there were no police boxes.
And hearing Tony there talking about how he saw a policeman come out of the doors once when he was a child there, when he visited London, that's obviously that memory would have happened to you, Tony, in colour, not in black and white. But but when you tell us a story like that, it just immediately comes to to mind in black and white. It's quite extraordinary because of that box and those memories and the kind of, I suppose, the romanticized vision of the 1960s that we've got, and how cozy those boxes are. Because inside, in the Whoniverse, we find a gleaming console room full of controls and a high-tech view screen. It's all powered by an alien energy source that we've never really been able to nail down within the series, have we? But how those things come together, how the imagination, how that food for the imagination was able to be sold, not just to one generation of kids, but now 3 or 4 or 5, one after the other. I think it's been a precise sort of balancing act of talents and of solid writing, just enough to not pull the curtain away too much. We don't really need to know how the TARDIS works, do we? For the magic to work on us as a viewer. Yeah. But as fans, though, Simon, we latch onto these things, don't we? And you always say that we don't consume Doctor Who passively. So there is this hunger to find out, how did they do that? Which came first? Who cast this spell?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's how Doctor Who fans are. We're just not very good at just sitting and watching. We do want to sort of pick it all apart, and we want to understand how it sort of formed. And certainly, you know, I remember when I first got into Doctor Who, and then in particular watching An Unearthly Child for the first time ever in 1983 when it was broadcast on BBC Two. In the Five Faces season, and that was the point that I think I kind of became obsessed, if that's the right word, with the TARDIS, because it's you go back to that original TARDIS, don't you, Tony? And there is something very magical about the origins of the police box and the design and the TARDIS itself. And An Unearthly Child just sort of captures that sort of magic perfectly, I think, and that's why I became obsessed by it. Certainly in that first episode, when they spend half of the episode in the console room, just being in that environment, talking about it, and that's a magical time, isn't it, Tony?
Oh yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly with what Dan was just saying. Then you think about the. People think that because it's in black and white, oh no, we're not going to watch it these days. But that black and white opening episode, the way the TARDIS is lit, the flashing lights, not just on the console itself, but the fact that you've got pulsing lights on the computer banks behind the scanner screen, the roundels light up when the ship's in flight. It's what people tend to forget these days. I think it's a case of familiarity breeding contempt. We're 60 years away from it first airing, but nobody in 1963 had ever seen a set like that. Mm-hmm. It genuinely is unique, and I'm not misusing that word.
You're correct.
There was nothing like it before, and no matter what variations have come since, I'd hesitate to use the word icon, but
it is.
I would agree with that.
If it isn't a cultural icon, it is very, very close to being. It's so identifiable.
Well, if it isn't a cultural icon, I genuinely don't. Yeah, I don't know what. And the other thing, Tony, that we've got to remember, that I think it's very, very easy to forget. You talk about familiarity, you know, breeding, not contempt isn't the right word, but we've become
complacency,
complacent.
maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. We become complacent. And the thing is, you know, we've got to try and cast ourselves back, which none of us can do, to 1963 when An Unearthly Child first screened, and nobody had a clue that police box standing in the junkyard, they were going to go inside and suddenly walk into that room. That as I say, we take it for granted now, but it was that must have been mind blowing at the time, because nobody was ready for it.
Yeah. I mean, you've got your memories of the 1983 repeat as your first memory of it. I suppose, if I'm being honest, that would be the first time that I would have seen it transmitted on live television, because I wasn't old enough to remember the first episode. There is just something so magical about that set. I get
I think I'd go one further, Tony and Simon, as well. It is a character in its own right. I mean, when you go back to An Unearthly Child and you were saying like half the episode is just in that room, but it's never done. There's always something going off, whether it's the lighting or the movement. There's something for you to catch your eye.
It's as if, Sarah, that prolonged period of time in there and all that dialogue was there just to sell it. If to sell us over an extended period of time on that premise that you could step through that magic door and be somewhere else, and they didn't need to do it again. But if they cast the spell and set it that deep in the children's imaginations, they think, right, I'm on board for this. I'll go wherever, and that probably is a large proportion of it, of what sort of powered the show from that moment onwards, because they never, every time a new supporting character came in, they didn't go and sort of retrace that and do it all over again. Did they? You get a couple of sentences or something like that, but because the thought was always for the audience. Well, the audience, they already know this. The reality of it is that you probably would have that conversation over and over again, but not for the purposes of sort of populist TV.
Yeah, you do kind of take it for granted, especially, and know who is guilty of this, because it's kind of become a joke. And yes, it is an affectionate joke, but I do worry that it does take away from that power. And obviously, when I saw the TARDIS properly in Rose and Rose's reaction to that, when you go back and you watch An Unearthly Child, I wish I'd have been able to have seen it before. And you do have to kind of take a step back, and when you watch it and you realise, wow, this is really powerful. This is a momentous moment, and we've kind of over the years it's it's bigger on the inside, or it's smaller.
Yeah,
that's right. It's bigger on the inside, it's smaller on the outside, and you can't. Yeah, all right.
Yeah,
but this was a big deal.
And the amount of people you see, famous people, Simon, take that moment. If ever there's a police box prop, if they're visiting the Doctor Who set, or there's just a TARDIS somewhere at some real world location, even if there's the tiniest part of you that was a Doctor Who fan growing up, never mind still on it. You don't have to be a lifelong Doctor Who fan to do this, because I know several people who aren't, who if you go through their photo albums or their reel on their phone, and they've happened to be anywhere where there's been some sort of Doctor Who installation, they've taken that moment to say to their partner or their child or their cousin or their friend or whoever's with them, to say, just take a picture of me doing this. And it's because of that cultural resonance.
Well, and it's the same, you look at there's still that police box prop outside Earl's Court. There's still one up at Scarborough. There's still a police box up at Scarborough. And again, I've seen so many people who are not necessarily Doctor Who fans just putting up on Facebook a photo of them outside one of those two boxes. And of course, there's lots in Glasgow. And people take photos again outside the police box in Glasgow. You don't have to be a Doctor Who fan. It just is one of those iconic, and it is totally fair in this context to use the overused word iconic, because it is iconic, and that's why everybody wants their photo taken outside it, and it's immediately identifiable. You don't have to be a Doctor Who fan to know what that shape is. And that's why it's one of the reasons why it's endeared, and why it's just so perfect that somebody came up with the idea. It's beautiful.
And you don't need to be scientifically minded either to invest in the idea simply, I suppose, Sarah, of a magic door. You can look at it just like that if you like.
Yeah. Well, it is the simplest, thing, and the connotations. It's very much like the wardrobe in Narnia. I suppose it really derives from that. But anything. It's what's behind this door, and the fact that it could be anywhere, anything. It's but the best thing about the TARDIS is how effectively it was done.
Yeah, there's lots more of that, and precisely where Tony comes into it and out of it and back into it again. That's all coming up after I remind you, if you'd like to do some real-time travelling of your own, each and every edition of this show, past, present and future, is just a tap or two away on the device of your choice, but only if you know where to look. There's masses of reviews, previews, interviews, geek outs and deep dives with all our regular panellists and some pretty awesome guests. In fact, there's something for every fan over over at type40.podbean.com. More boasting about all of that later, and we'll be making contact with the matrix of all knowledge that we call the Fandom Podcast Network for a word about all the other treats for the ears on offer across all the other shows over there. New adventures await inside the TARDIS in just a few days' time, in fact, as the 60th anniversary event series is about to begin. Join us now on a trip back in time, making various stops in celebration of the best ship in the universe. Yes, here we are in 2023 at the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who itself, and when the publicity campaign really started to kick in for this event miniseries, well, we were shown very, very little, really, and we still know not a great deal more as we're down to the last days until transmission. And the posters, initially they featured the 14th Doctor, played by David Tennant there, with Catherine Tate, but the TARDIS, it was background on all of these original early posters, sort of lit by this kind of nebula, as if there was some power pushing them all towards us. And the TARDIS is effectively the third regular cast member. And the series, any promotional picture you will see for Doctor Who, regardless of how the cast generally changes, I think everybody knows it's Doctor Who, even if you're just passing it from the top floor of a bus, you're passing a poster along the road or something like that, you think, oh, this is Doctor Who. But the TARDIS is probably the very first thing you see. It's that emblematic, it's that iconic. Obviously, the BBC didn't design the police box, but having the idea to marry the police box shell to the concept of the time-space capsule that had been arrived at via a process of that focus group who'd worked on Doctor Who for all those months in 1963, that is a kind of magic in itself, put together by a group of people who were just all on the payroll of the British Broadcasting Corporation. And the BBC was then, just as it is now, funded by the British population through the TV licence fee. And whilst I've got no doubt, Simon, that back in the 50s and the early 60s, it was definitely a more experimental and free time. I've got no doubt either that back then there were also hierarchies, pecking orders, budgets, clocks that were ticking, and very firm sort of lines in the sand of that which one could do and couldn't do within any of those sort of allotted quotas. And so much so that you think, well, it would be next to impossible for that kind of magic to happen, for a design that would last and a relationship that would last 60 years to come into being. But yet it did. Do you think we can over-romanticize this as fans? Or in this instance, it really isn't just hype. This was a kind of magic.
The people that were putting Doctor Who together at that point in 1963 did not know what they were creating. They certainly had no idea, and it would have been furthest from their thoughts that we would be sitting here 60 years later talking about them doing that in those dusty, smoky old offices.
Because it wouldn't be fair to paint them out as simply like civil servants, would it?
No. It wouldn't, but the fact remains that they were doing a job. They were just there. They were being paid to get this program on air. That's all they were doing. They didn't think they were doing anything big or clever. They just knew they've got to get a show on air for a certain date because they'd been told to do so by their bosses. And so whilst there's no doubt that this is lightning in a bottle, the definition was virtually created for Doctor Who of lightning in a bottle. They didn't realise they were doing it at the time, did they, Tony?
No. As you say, they were all employed by the Beam, jobbing directors, jobbing designers, jobbing floor managers, jobbing cameramen, jobbing sound engineers, scene shifters, the people that painted the floor, the people that took the set apart at the end of the day's recording and trundled it into the goods lift. Yeah, all employees just doing well, I was going to say a 9 till 5 job. It's more of a 9 a.m. till 10 at night job.
Yeah.
But by the
And
time
I imagine, I can
finished,
picture them doing that as well. The picture that you paint there, Tony,
Yeah.
I can imagine them in those sort of brown jackets going right from the collar, Sarah, down to probably to below the knee, come to think of it. We've all seen them, haven't we?
Yeah, yeah.
it's absolutely true. You get these little brown fellas in brown Macintoshes. You see them on these skit shows, but that's exactly the type of thing. The scene shifters were there in their overalls.
I get the impression, Tony, though, that neither was a responsibility to doing the best job that they could with those public funds.
There's a lot of I won't say nonsense, a lot of misunderstanding about the origins of Doctor Who, I think, from what I can see, having looked at the paperwork that's been made available down the years. And if you look on the Whoniverse website, the iPlayer website, as of the 1st of November, they've released a whole lot more documents.
Yeah, I've seen.
Which shows the gestation of Doctor Who. What at the point that's entered into mythos is that nobody in the BBC wanted Doctor Who, that nobody liked Doctor Who, nobody knew what to do with Doctor Who. And it's perfectly true that Doctor Who was initially booked for a run of 4 weeks. It was just the Tribe of Gum. Believe it or not, the success of the pilot episode, even though everybody regards it now as a complete failure, was enough to prompt Donald Baverstock, the then controller of BBC Television, BBC One, as he became to be known. The success of the pilot show, in his eyes, actually meant that he extended the contract from the initial 4 weeks to a 13-week run. The controller of BBC One wanted to do it. Sidney Newman wanted to do it. I mentioned the fact that the pilot show wasn't regarded as a success. You get technical failures like the doors of the TARDIS jamming open and cameras seeing the studio lights and the no smoking signs in the ceiling, that kind of thing.
I would imagine that things like that were probably more common in pilots than we'd believe, because obviously most pilot episodes don't get watched by feverish fans on digital media, 50, 60. A lot of them never see the light of day at all, don't they? So there's probably just as many things went wrong on other pilots.
But this is the point about the pilot show. Most people think that the pilot show would have been transmitted had the technical issues not occurred.
Oh.
Right? So as part of that initial 4-week run.
Yeah.
It wasn't. It was funded as a pilot with no intention of it ever being shown.
Okay.
So had they not liked the pilot, they might never even have actually made the first 4 episodes at all.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was done for internal consumption primarily.
Okay.
Had it been a success, technically, they could have shown it and saved themselves the $2,500 that they spent.
Because now that is commonplace, isn't it? Particularly in American television, they make pilots, some get picked up and some don't. And when it goes to a full series, sometimes they get remade and sometimes they don't. I'm curious though, Tony, about where the design department would have come into this and how design staff would have been allocated, because obviously they didn't have a science fiction department. So yeah, they'd have had people, I would imagine, a department full of people, all with a certain skill requirement to be a designer. But obviously the BBC was making period dramas, they were making kitchen sink dramas, they were making sitcoms and children's shows. So if they got on staff designers, how would they allocate who was going to be working on which show? Would they know their strengths and weaknesses, or would it simply be who was back from holiday? Have you got that block of time there? We need somebody who can do 5 days on project A. You go and do that, and you see what you come up with. How close to the mark is that?
My understanding is that Verity Lambert wanted a dedicated designer from the very beginning. She was originally given Peter Brahashki, who unfortunately fell ill after the pilot episode had been recorded, so he couldn't continue in his duties. That role then passed to Barry Newbury, and the sheer amount of workload that he was facing as the series was confirmed beyond the 13 weeks initial run meant that Raymond Cusick was brought on board, so that Barry Newbury and Raymond Cusick alternated in design duties. So those two people were allocated to Doctor Who. Verity Lambert apparently wasn't particularly happy with Peter Brahashki's work in the first place and requested a change of designer, but that was only a request. It wasn't something that she could ever have insisted on, because these people were all BBC employees.
That's what I thought.
So the head of scenic services would say, oh yeah, Barry Newbury, for argument's sake, he's interested in Italian architecture from the Renaissance, so we might like to give him an historical series to do. So yeah, there is the element of designers having strengths, which people would obviously be aware of, but the fact of the matter is, it's whoever was available to do the work. So if Peter had finished working, I don't know, on an episode of Z Cars prior to starting on Doctor Who, he'd be then asked by the head of department, right, you finished on Z Cars, now go and start on Doctor Who for us. So the designers didn't get a choice, neither did the producers, really.
Tony, do we know, because there's always been this sort of been shrouded in mystery. You just mentioned there that Verity Lambert was unhappy with Peter's initial design work, and there's always been this sort of mystery about the initial design of the console room, as in, was it that Peter's heart and soul weren't in it and he quickly just literally knocked off this sort of vague hexagonal roundelled design off on the back of a packet of fags? Or is it that Verity wasn't sort of happy with the design that he was very proud of it, and he poured his heart and soul into it, and Verity wasn't happy, and maybe it's that she didn't like this sort of roundel hexagonal design that he come up with? Do we know anything at all about the truth of all of this sort of myth?
Peter Brahashki was a sculptor by trade. He moved from Poland at the end of the Second World War, settled briefly in a refugee camp just outside of Liverpool while he got his British citizenship. He was very much into his 1950s repeated geometrical designs. So if you look at something from anywhere from the 1950s, you've got your plastics, you've got your formicas, you've got...
Yes, now you said it, I can absolutely see what you're saying. Looking at those roundels that are on screen at the moment on that initial design, you're right. I'd never clocked it before, but it's a 1950s design. I'd never seen that before.
It's a repeated geometry. I mean, it takes its inspiration from nature. You've got a bee's honeycomb wall for the TARDIS, haven't you?
Yeah.
So that is very much the kind of thing that was going on in the 1950s.
Yeah, you're right.
Plastic is fantastic. You know, everybody had plastic chairs or mica-covered tables.
So do we think that he was proud of his design? Do you think?
I can absolutely state that without fear of contradiction. That design is designed to fit one way round in Studio D, Lime Grove. Studio D, Lime Grove was a strange shaped studio. Had little bits taken out for production galleries, bits taken out for fuse boxes, and so on. The reason there's a dog leg in the TARDIS walls is to fit around the electrical junction box in the space side of Studio D. The man knew exactly what he was doing. The reason I think that Verity Lambert requested a change, was because he'd fallen ill. He was a very unwell man by this stage in his life. Suffered because of the privations that he'd experienced in the Second World War.
Yeah.
So he had repeated bouts of hospitalisation due to stomach ulcers, and he was actually in his later life suffering from cancer as well. So he wasn't a particularly well man. He'd been allocated late to Doctor Who. You
think that it maybe is a myth that it was a rush job because his heart wasn't in it and he was just throwing something together because he couldn't be bothered? You think it was maybe more that it was a last-minute thing?
I just do not believe that at all. The detail is just incredible there. I mean...
Painstaking. Annotated.
It's all annotated. It tells you what metal to use, what colour perspex to use. That's one of his instructions. Make it look like plastic.
Right.
So he's a product of his time. He knew exactly what he wanted. He overshot. on the budget by a gigantic amount, a frightening amount.
Was that down to ambition and enthusiasm for the project, Tony, or simply not being, or I hate to say this, not being particularly good at his job and not particularly realistic and needed to be reining in? What was it?
Well, in his later life, he was nominated for a BAFTA award for his design work on When the Boat Comes In. That was towards the end of his BBC career, by which stage he was a senior designer within the BBC alongside Ray Cusick, who was also a senior designer within the BBC. You don't get promoted to be a senior designer if you're surly and you're sulky and you don't know what you're doing. You know, eventually you get the boot or you resign and find yourself another job, don't you?
I wonder whether, as I say, maybe Verity didn't think much of his design. I don't know. Do you think that's possible?
It may be more that he was a very shy man, quite a withdrawn man. There are numerous reports of him being difficult to get on with, not because he was nasty, but because he was, in essence, a shy bloke.
I mean, again, it'd be interesting to sort of go back to the initial documents. And again, I don't know whether this has become sort of apparent, Tony, as to is there any sort of description of the interior of the spaceship in those initial scripts at all? Was Peter given any guidance by either the writers of the scripts or the writers of the document, the pre-production documents, the briefings and the synopses and so on?
Well, the way it would have worked is that the basic concept of the show would have been worked out by people like C. Webber, Sidney Newman beforehand.
Yes.
They'd actually got the concept of the show bolted down before even Verity Lambert was brought on board. So they knew they wanted a time traveller. They knew they wanted the earthly companions as the audience his way into the show. The Doctor was defined as being grouchy, but with a twinkle in his eye. So they knew what they were after in general terms, but in terms of specifics, because Brahashki wasn't appointed as the show's designer until such a late day in preparations, they had precious little time to exchange their views with him. In fact, the first meeting he had with them lasted apparently half an hour, and he ended up saying, "Well, I've got to go now, chaps, because I've got 2 weeks' worth of work to do on this project before I can even start with you." So it wasn't until sort of 3 weeks before they were due to start designing and building the set that Peter actually became involved.
And I suppose why would he think so extensively about a project that was weeks away when he's got something that he's doing in 24, 48, 72 hours?
One of the documents that came to light at the beginning of November on the iPlayer says that each episode of Doctor Who is given the equivalent of 7 days of designer time and 500 hours to build the designs. Every episode. That's in the financial documentation that's come out. So it's fairly standard practice just to give your designer a week's notice to, right, there you go, we want a spaceship, please. Top off, Peter, come back with the designs. It's not changed at all. Simon's worked in the TV industry. He'll tell you how long things take to decide, and once they've decided, all hell breaks loose, and all of a sudden, 10 days later, you're in the middle of Dartmoor and Newelly's filming an episode of whatever.
But this is why, to an extent, we sort of have to take a step back from that design of the console room and look at it and realize actually the genius of it, because they could so easily, and when you think about it now, making what at that point, as you say, Tony, was a pilot episode and nothing more than a pilot, on next to nothing in a studio that was very basic, they could so easily have just said, all we need is let's just have some black drapes. We'll have a couple of computer consoles, some wires hanging down, something that might have looked a bit more similar to what they did ultimately in the Peter Cushing movies. They could have that would have been so easy to do, and I can't help thinking that is the kind of thing that they would have done logically. So something made them think, no, we're going to be a bit more. We're going to put more effort into this. We don't want just black drones.
Do you think that it partly as well is because that this set very seldom, once the adventure, and adventures of Doctor Who back then would typically last between 4 and 8-ish weeks, 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And once the adventure was up and running, they'd very seldom go back to the interior of the TARDIS, would they? So obviously they wouldn't leave this set up for 2 months. They were making Marco Polo. They wouldn't have that in one corner of that studio, would they? It would be taken down and then put back up 6 or 7 weeks later. Would that be how it would? So perhaps
That's exactly right. There weren't such things as standing sets back then. Nowadays, the modern TARDIS set, it'll be built on a welded metal frame. The metal frame will be bolted to the studio floor, and in all intents and purposes, it'll be there for 3 years or however long shooting Gatwa stays in the role, or before they decide to redecorate the TARDIS.
But because that's why, Tony, isn't it? That's why the TARDIS console room changes so many times, because it had. Well, firstly, they started, didn't they? They quite quickly started to trim it down a bit. For example, the canopy that you're talking about, that went very early on because it was just a pain in the backside to put up there. And then, of course, they would have been dictated to by how many other sets were in the studio for that particular episode that was shooting. So they might only be left with a small corner for the TARDIS this week, for the console room this week. And so all we can manage is a couple of flats. We can't have the fourth locator in this week. We can't have all these of computer consoles there.
Well, but bear in mind that the full-size TARDIS set was just short of 50 feet long by just over 36 feet wide. It's pushing 3,000 square feet. If you add in the bedrooms and all the little bits of corridors that you get to see in the Edge of Destruction, Brink of Disaster, where that's the only time you ever see the full set. And it is vast. It filled a third of the studio. And that is not a small set at all.
No, and they didn't even make all of the round door walls. They just took a photo and blew them up, didn't they? As ostensibly it's supposed to be a pill packet. Yes.
But I actually think it's the mesh that you get on the drum on the inside of a washing machine.
Would they have had it back in those days in the 60s? Would the drum on the inside of a washing machine have looked the same? Probably would, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that's what they photographed. I can't prove that, but that's what
do you know what, Tony? I think you're more likely to be correct on that. I've never gone with the pill packet theory for the simple fact that I don't think they had blister packs like that in the 60s.
They did, actually.
Did they?
Yeah. I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry for 18 years, and they had little display cabinets going back to the 1950s.
Really?
Wow, I didn't know that.
They've always had, since plastic was invented.
And they still use blow-ups for walls now to this day, don't they? So again, these are tricks of the trade, I suppose. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If these things still work on screen now, even in the digital age, why would you do anything any differently? If you could, it's the magic of TV making and film, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah. Tricks of the trade haven't changed a bit. All that's happened is they've got better cameras and better lighting equipment.
But actually, again, going back to, for example, those early episodes, the Daleks is a great example because we see a fair bit of the interior of the console room in the Daleks. And certainly, as you said, the Edge of Destruction and the Brink of Disaster, you obviously see nothing but the interior of the TARDIS. Yeah. And for all of the basic quality of those cameras at the time, the outdatedness of them, it translates remarkably well to screen. And what I'm always struck by is it's a very elegant design. It's a very simple, but a very elegant, well-proportioned design. Again, you look at the console, that 6-sided console, and it's just a beautiful, elegant, simple design, but it works so well. And again, I mean, I remember, I'd be interested to know who came up with this idea, because I know that the original idea for the console was that it was meant to be operated by a couple of people, wasn't it? That's why it was designed around this central idea of a central console. But I wonder whether it was Peter that came up with the sort of hexagon with that pedestal kind of style, and the time rotor in the middle, which obviously wasn't called a time rotor at the time. It was just that central glass column. You know, I'd love to go back and find out who came up with these designs, because they're just beautiful, so elegant.
That's Mr. Brahashki. That's purely his work.
Or, you know, how much of it was from his brain? And we'll never know the answer to this. How much was from his brain? How much was from the brain of people like Anthony Coburn, who wrote the first 4 episodes, you know, Sidney Newman, C.E. Weber? Who came up with this stuff? It's, to a large extent, it's lost to the mists of time, isn't it? The actual finer details.
I think you're perfectly correct. You're never going to get to the bottom of anything like that, because private conversations, telephone conversations weren't recorded in those days. All you've got to go on is the actual official documentation, which frankly, in most cases, is as dull as ditch water.
Yeah.
You know, it's talking about finance, talking about scheduling dates, talking about it's not going to be ready. It's going to have a knock-on effect on all our production going down for the rest of the financial year. This kind of thing. We've got oodles of evidence on that, but we've only got anecdotal evidence on what people thought of each other and what conversations took place behind closed doors. I will actually say that you're wrong about one thing, Simon.
Please correct me.
That console was designed to be operated by one person only.
Is that what it was?
It originally was supposed to have handles on each of the 6 corners, and it was originally supposed to spin round. So if you can imagine the Doctor spinning the console round, so we could operate.
Oh, I see.
To do
when you said operated by 1 or 2 people, I thought you meant perhaps there was one guy sat in the base of the console pushing the time rotor up and down with an air pump, and somebody else sort of flicking the switches on. But you actually mean by the actor pilot.
It was conceived to be operated by a single, what we now know to be a Time Lord. Russell T Davies, when he says it's got 6 sides, it needs 6 operators, he's wrong.
Right, okay.
Well, I've learned something today.
If you actually look on the earliest photographs of the console, you can see that it's stood on a little circular platform.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I did see that.
Railway track. That's a little railway track for it to spin round on.
But they obviously abandoned it before.
They abandoned that idea.
Yeah, I'm guessing that it just was one technicality too far.
Yeah, why you don't need it just to get yourself to land in an adventure and to depart from an adventure, do you?
By a kind of accident, I suppose. This wouldn't have been what they were thinking by any stretch of the imagination. But the idea that the Doctor, if he'd been doing it all himself and spinning that console around, because I love that idea as a designer myself, as a creative myself, you think, of course he would. It make perfect sense. So I like that. But from a viewer's point of view, and somebody who's grown up loving this show, and the dynamic between the regular characters, that warmth of the Doctor stood on one side and saying, I can't quite reach that one, Vicky. Can you just flick that switch for me? Can you open the doors? If he'd have been able to spin the TARDIS round, the console round, then that wouldn't have been possible. And that familiar sort of family feel to it, of it being a cooperative and of trust as well. This is my spacecraft, but you can push that button, you can pull that lever, you can read that screen. That wouldn't be there, would it?
Yeah. On balance, it's probably a mistake to try and make it rotate, if for no other reason, as you say, dramatic purposes, as well as the technical issues that you get unhitching airlines and things like that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I take your point on board wholly on that, Dan. I think you're quite right. It would have spoiled the illusion.
I'd love to see sort of later Time Lords in later models, maybe, Sarah. If they were chasing the Doctor down, there was a fugitive Time Lord, isn't it, at the start? If other Time Lords were looking for him, maybe they were in sort of slicker models like Type 80s that could do that.
It'd be like the equivalent of the TIE fighters, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, when is it said that the Doctor borrowed the TARDIS Can you remember when
What,
is that
first?
first mentioned? Yeah, when is that first mentioned that he's
Oh.
borrowed the TARDIS? I'm trying to think thinking back to an unearthly child. What do they say? They just say they're fugitives, don't they? They're
Yeah,
fugitives.
they just said I come from a different world and a different time, don't they?
Yeah.
I
So
would imagine you're getting up towards war games with Pat Trout.
I would have
You
thought
get that
so.
idea coming in.
Because that's when they sort of start to talk about the fact that it was kind of a defunct TARDIS, don't they? It was one in for repairs. It was an old model that nobody wanted. That's when that sort of thought starts to come.
And there's a romance to that in itself as well, isn't it? It's very, very British. This isn't the USS Enterprise, which is sort of like the flagship of the fleet. This is defunct. They've pensioned this thing off. It's last year's model. That's a very British sensibility.
But what's also interesting, of course, in those early episodes, the implication is that the Doctor has made the TARDIS himself, and there's all that business about Susan coming up with the name. So there's that feeling very much, isn't there, Tony?
That he's maintained it over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, the mythology of Doctor Who can't be described as being consistent, can it?
No.
Looking at the TARDIS itself away from the console room, we sometimes, now and again, we do see the bedrooms, for example, in the TARDIS, don't we? Or the food machine, sort of recreational areas. Was that something that they originally conceived of, that Peter Brahatsky or Barry Newbury or Verity Lambert or anybody in the process would have said, it's got to have this, it's got to have that? Or would that have been suggestions from each individual writer who just writing their little story and they put in a bit about, before Barbara goes to sleep or Barbara needs to go for a nap, she may say this. And so extra sets were created, were magicked into existence by the department when the script decided, or was it always intended that there be other rooms, other component parts to it?
Initially, when the pilot episode was made, so the initial design, it didn't have any ancillary rooms. All you got was the control room and the police box and the extra set of police box doors to give the illusion of Barbara bursting directly into the ship. When they did the remount, they spent more money on this dratted set and built a pair of doors that looked like it was leading off to the bedrooms. But because Doctor Who had only been commissioned to run for 13 weeks, even though the pilot was deemed a success, they had to try to recoup the cost of the TARDIS set over that period. They'd spent £4,253 on this set, which would have bought you a 4-bedroom semi-detached house in 1963.
Good Lord.
Yeah.
That is a vast amount of
Right.
So that in itself shows you the statement of faith that the BBC were prepared to put into Doctor Who. All right, they balked at the final bill for the TARDIS set, and it nearly got the show cancelled. But that is a measure of the commitment that they put in. They invested the equivalent of a 4-bedroom semi-detached house on that one set. To get the money's worth out of that set, they had to use it in the first 13 weeks. So you get, as you said, Simon, half of the initial episode is entirely set within the TARDIS.
Yeah.
You then get 2 episodes, The Edge of Destruction, Brink of Disaster, which was meant to close the initial 13-week run. And that, they purposely built the bedrooms for that story. But it all comes out of this same £4,253 pot. So whether it was never intended that the TARDIS had bedrooms in the first story, because, as you said, Dan, these things are script driven. But the point is, they knew that they had to have at least 2 full episodes set in the TARDIS to try and justify the cost of that set. So a small amount extra to build some 4 fold down beds was a minor expense.
Do you think, Tony, there was sort of any consideration given to what today we sort of know as modular sets, i.e. sets with flats that can be rearranged, that can be changed, that the configuration can be altered to fit that, do you think there was consideration given to that? Because they weren't certain at that point quite how often they'd use the ship and by how much.
You are exactly right on that point, Simon. As Dan said earlier, for something like Marco Polo, you just get one wall of the TARDIS and maybe the console.
Yeah.
Because the rest of it would be taken up, the rest of the studio space would be taken up by Kublai Khan's throne room or whatever. The set was designed to be deliberately modular. You would very, very, very rarely see it in its fully assembled form. In fact, like I say, it's just Edge of Destruction where you.
It would just need to be enough component parts in any orientation to evoke that sense of being in that environment, whether to top or tail an adventure.
To top or tail.
And again, in that respect, it was actually something of a genius design on Peter's part, because
incredible.
It can do that. It still looks like, you forget the fact that it could have just been a black set with black drapes and some wires that could very easily be done. What he's actually done is he's gone one step beyond that, and he's designed a really good, interesting, visually, aesthetically pleasing, arresting design, but that is also very, very practical for the requirements of the studio.
No, hearing none of this, Simon, is in any way taking anything away from my enjoyment or appreciation of this. In fact,
it's making me marvel more because it's so forward thinking.
You begin to appreciate it more, what they actually did. Because you do get complacent to it.
Well, if you think about, say, something like Coronation Street, which has been going more or less the same amount of time as Doctor Who, even those sets weren't themselves standing sets. They were always assembled in the same way. So the bar in the Rover's Return was always in the left-hand corner. Well, I don't watch the programme, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But you get the idea. The pub always has to look.
Yes.
You can't suddenly have a door appear in the middle of a wall that wasn't there previously. But the magic of Doctor Who, you can. Bill Hartnell was actually given a line in the early days that the TARDIS had soft architecture.
Brilliant.
Justify why people were starting to notice that it was assembled a different way each week.
Was that standard practice, do you think? An episode of Dixon of Dock Green, for example, if one week more of the episode was taking place in the courtroom, and they needed to make it maybe a standing set with a court, did they just construct that week one part of the front desk of Doc Green Nick? Was that standard practice within making television then, or was it that Peter and the team working on this show really, really were thinking ahead and thinking outside the box to make this show feasible, not just to get up and running, but to stay running to this format that had been arrived upon, this sort of anthology serial thing that could potentially run for sort of 3/4 of the year?
Taking your example of Dixon and Dock Green, it's exactly the same thing as the point I was trying to make with Corrie. You wouldn't suddenly have a door appear behind the sergeant's desk that hadn't been there the previous week. So that type of set would always be assembled the same way. Okay, you might not get the prison cells shown in a given episode, but when the prison cells are required for a given episode, they would be assembled in the same way they'd been when they were.
Whereas the TARDIS was different literally every week, every single time it appears on screen. It's different in some way, pretty much every week.
And that is down to the practicalities of how much is actually set within the TARDIS in a given story.
And so that's why it is clever to think that they did it in such a way that it was able to be adjusted to that extent, to a major extent. Because they never quite knew how many sets they were going to have in any given week, and thus how much room they'd have for the TARDIS.
Talking about making enough time and space, time for us to parade all those other podcasts before your very ears and eyes right now. Kev's going to fill you in on it all, and then you can meet Simon, Sarah, Tony, and myself back here in a couple of minutes for more talk about the Doctor's time space capsule, the TARDIS, on its 60th birthday.
Thank you for listening. We hope you're enjoying this podcast. Here are the other great shows on the Fandom Podcast Network. Culture Clash, where we discuss the latest in entertainment and pop culture. Blood of Kings, our show covering the entire Highlander universe. Couch Potato Theater, we celebrate our favorite movies. And Time Warp, our Fandom Flashback show discussing a year in movies and our favorite retro movie, TV, and pop culture topics. Good Evening, discussing all things Alfred Hitchcock. Hair Metal Podcast, we cover the rock metal music of the 80s and early 90s. Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast, discussing the time-traveling Doctor Who universe. Lethal Mullet, an action film podcast covering the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Also, check out the Lethal Mullet Network for more great podcasts. What a Piece of Junk, our Star Wars podcast. Making Treks, a Star Trek podcast with a deep dive into the final frontier. The Fandom Show, our Fandom Podcast Network live YouTube show discussing the hottest topics in fandom. The True Believers MCU podcast discussing the Marvel Cinematic and Television Universe. Union Federation, our Star Trek and the Orville Show. And we're proud to welcome the BQN Network to the Fandom Podcast Network. Please visit our friends on the BQN Network, a Star Trek Universe podcast that also includes your favorite topics, movies, history, superheroes, and more. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on YouTube. The Fandom Podcast Network is also on all major podcast platforms. The Fandom Podcast Network audio master feed is on Podbean at fpnet.podbean.com. You can find the Fandom Podcast Network on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can email us at fandompodcastnetwork@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, respect others and enjoy your fandom.
Yes, we've teased and tantalised you there, and we can even clothe you too. There's merch to match all of those shows, including Type 40, if you head over to tpublic.com. Search for the Fandom Podcast Network, and that's where you'll find a store full of all the team colours for all of the podcasts, on everything from T-shirts to phone cases, up to enormous tapestries. Seeing is believing. Treat yourself. Treat your other selves. All goes to support the Fandom Podcast Network into the bargain. So everybody wins. Yeah, we're crossing time streams here and bumping police boxes together to create magic for the TARDIS's own 60th anniversary here on Type 40. So I've got Simon, Sarah, and our guest Tony Farrell here to dig a little deeper into his experiences as probably the police box TARDIS expert. Certainly in my experience, Tony, I've never heard knowledge on this sort of depth before.
Well, that's very kind. I'm sure there are other people that know probably just as much as I do.
You're too modest, my friend. Yes, so to bring it up to date a little, to more recent years, in 2017, the TV series was closing out the tenure, wasn't it, of the 12th Doctor, Peter Capaldi, and that entire production team, as led by Stephen Moffat. So Moffat had been there for 7-8 years, something like that. But for the Christmas special that year, he'd conceived of a story that would once again bring the Doctor face to face with one of his previous incarnations. In this instance, it was the very first, which did necessitate within that script, yet again, we're talking about the necessities of a script driving a show, but this script necessitated the use of the original TARDIS too, didn't it? The original TARDIS console room. But that set was struck decades ago, wasn't it? And to be honest, even if it hadn't have been, it was looking worse for wear, wasn't it? Come 1970, 1971. So the idea was, I suppose, to evoke the feel of the original time-space capsule as best as they could. But obviously, they had to remake it and reconceive it based on those original principles, but make it fit for viewing and for working with in the HD generation. What I want to know, Tony, is where and how did you come into it?
Oh, right. Okay. Like you, Dan, we're both members of a couple of Facebook groups, aren't we? There are things that focus on TARDIS building, the TARDIS Builders website, where people like us, nerds and geeks and...
Speak for yourself.
People are necessarily obsessed with minor little television programs that have somehow managed to last 60 years, go to hang out with our friends. I joined a group called the TARDIS Builders in, I about 2010. And it's like all other internet groups. It's made up of people from different backgrounds, different ages, different skill sets, different interests, but they're all brought together basically by a love of the TARDIS. So you might get young kids who do what Simon did, make a TARDIS out of a PG Tips tea bag box. But equally, that site attracts industry professionals. When I joined it, nobody had actually come up with any what I would consider accurate plans for either for the police box exterior or for the control room interior. So over the course of about 3 years leading up to the show's 50th anniversary, I started looking at these designs and working out what the thing was made out of, how big it was, what its dimensions were, to try and build an accurate picture, just for my own interest, but as a resource for other people so that they could come and after me and build replica consoles. You know, like people build replica Daleks. There are people out there that build replica TARDISes. There's a guy called Ben May, I think. His replica police box is currently on display in Riverside Studios. He built that box according to my plans.
Wow.
So I know that that's an accurate representation of the first police box exterior, he says modestly. People who are far more skilled at computers than I am could see what I was trying to do in the TARDIS Builders Guild, that I wanted to build truly accurate plans. And a couple of lads on there, one called Barry Ward and one called Slava Talanov, who comes from St. Petersburg, said, well, if you give us the plans, Tony, we'll build CGI models for you. And what we could then do with these CGI models is overlay them onto either video screen captures of the TARDIS or a particular element of the TARDIS, or onto photographs of the TARDIS. So what they do is I give them what I thought were the dimensions. They'd build a wire frame and overlay it on top of the photograph. If it matched, I knew my dimensions were accurate. If it didn't match, I'd toddle off and tweak the dimensions, come back, repeat the process hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of times using hundreds of photographs and hundreds of screen grabs. And eventually, between us, we came up with a set of plans that matched every photograph that we could conceivably lay these CGI wireframes onto. So I knew at the end of the day that my plans for the TARDIS exterior and the TARDIS interior are accurate to what was built in 1963. So if I say that that panel is 11.5 inches wide by 15.25 inches tall, you can bet your bottom dollar that's exactly what size those panels are. There are numerous examples. We've not just done it once, we've done it hundreds upon hundreds of times. And eventually, no matter what angle the police box is photographed from, you can put a wireframe over it and it will match. And that way you know that the dimensions I've stated in my plans are accurate. So it's teamwork. Rob, as I said, Barry Ward and Slava Talanov, talented, really talented blokes. I couldn't have done that without them. Without them making those wireframes, I'd have had no chance of matching the plans to the photographs.
So, out of interest, Tony, were there no initial plans that existed?
Yes, there were, but I was never happy that they were accurate. You know, a fellow member of TARDIS Builders Guild was a chap called Matt Sanders. His interest was in the Metropolitan police boxes that physically existed in the 1950s, 60s before they were all demolished. And he's actually built himself a full-sized replica of the Metropolitan police box out of fiberglass. And he toddled off to Crick up in Derbyshire and took measurements from one of the surviving police boxes.
Yeah, I know it well.
Yeah. Now, in 2017, It was obvious by photographs that had appeared in the press that the original Cybermen were returning to Doctor Who for Peter Capaldi's closing season. And Matt Sanders, being a member of the TARDIS Builders Guild, initially asked me for help with the set for the polar base, the South Polar Base, and the little prison cell that William Hartnell finds himself in inside the Cyberman spaceship. Now, I've got the set plans for those. I beg your pardon. I've got the studio floor plans for those, which give you the dimensions, the lengths and breadths of the individual sets, but not the heights. So it's just literally a bird's eye view of the studio floor, and somebody's drawn the outline of the set on them, where the benches are, where the computer banks are, this kind of thing. So you can work out the dimensions, the flat dimensions, the footprint of the set. But what Matt was struggling with was to reproduce the height of the set. So I was able to sell him, well, hang on, you know certain things are standard, don't you? That set contains a couple of ladders. The distance between the rungs on a ladder
They're always the same.
Always the same. So if you know how many rungs there are on a ladder, you know the distance between the rungs of the ladder. That ladder's up the back of the set going up a wall. You know how hard that wall is. So it's quite simple. That's all I do. That's literally all I do. I take a known dimension or something that I think is a known dimension, compare it to what I'm trying to work out the dimensions of, stick it through Barry Ward's computer to create a wireframe model, and Bob's your uncle. So that's how I got involved. Matt Sanders and I were both members of the same group, and he approached me for help with the cyber prison ship, for want of a better description, and the South Pole control room base.
And that led on to work recreating the TARDIS console room. Yeah,
he knew, obviously, Matt knew of my work recreating the accurate dimensions for the TARDIS as it was first designed. So as his trust in me grew, he gradually saw the guard came down, and it became obvious that they were recreating the original TARDIS set. And would I like to help them with that? Could I provide them? Do you mind if I use your plans, Tony? Have you any further information, Tony? And there was like hundreds upon emails bouncing backwards and forwards. The day before they started recording, I get an email from Matt, and he says, which way around's the console supposed to be? Which panel's supposed to be facing the main doors? So he was going down to sort of that level. I said, well, it doesn't really matter, Matt, because basically
it varies every week.
Every week, you know. But it was nice to see a set that, even though it's not strictly accurate, it certainly captures the feel of the original set. Definitely captures it. It's a real interpretation.
You handed them all they needed to know.
I mean, obviously, the set design is not mine. That's Matt Sanders and Michael Pickwood's design. But they knew that the information that I'd given them on which they could base that design was accurate.
And it looked beautiful on screen. It made you feel like this was the same place, the same TARDIS, the same set. Just this is how it would have looked, I suppose, if we'd have had HD cameras back in 1963. These are the little details that we couldn't see then that we could now. And even the elements that were altered, that were rethought, they sit there pretty perfectly. I'm a big fan of what you all achieved on this, Tony. It really was a beautiful, beautiful touch. And every scene that takes place on that set, I'm looking. I mean, it's terrible. Sorry, Mark, if you're watching, or David, or Pearl. I am listening honestly to what you're saying, but I'm mostly just sort of looking around, darting my eyes all over this set and every tiny detail of every graphic, Tony.
I was like, the day I went down there in 23rd of June 2017, I was down on the set. Like I said, I saw Mark Gatiss eating his egg noodles for his lunch. I walked through the big bulkhead doors, and I was like a kid in a sweet shop. I really was. I mean, I could see, I knew bits weren't accurate, which, as you say, had been updated for the modern eye. But walking under that ceiling canopy and just gazing up at it, I was, I was there. I was back in 1963.
And did you get to speak to people on set? Did they know who you were? Did they know the involvement?
Yeah, Matt had been very kind. Matt Sanders had been very kind, and as we met people going down corridors and bumped into people, he said, "Oh, this is Tony. He's the guy that's given us the plans for the TARDIS." So, yeah, Rachel Talalay sent me a message after we'd finished saying how pleased they were with everything, which was nice.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And you can see that does look very, very large.
Yeah.
It's big. That's not even the full-size TARDIS set.
Mm-hmm.
That shares the same footprint as an unearthly child, which the control room was actually about two-thirds of its full size for that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's still big. It's still 30-odd feet long by 30 feet wide.
Did you have a favourite little detail where you had to take a second look and think, oh, they've only gone and done that?
My favourite bit, if you can see the Syrian candlestick.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a picture of me hugging it somewhere.
Oh, that's amazing.
There you go. That I just touched something that was on the set in 1963 was brilliant.
Hang on, was that the same candlestick that was on the actual set rather than a recreation?
No way.
Is that what you're telling me?
It's one of a pair.
Yeah,
That's
it is.
incredible.
They managed to get them from I think it's from the exact same prop hire company, wasn't it, Tony?
Post we got it from Trading Post.
Yeah, a Trading Post.
Yeah, it's a company just outside of Wembley Stadium in North London. It's still there today.
Incredible.
It's amazing, isn't it? And they were, as Tony says, right there on that initial set on an unearthly child. Yeah. Lovely to see a really good version of the Astral Man.
That came as a complete surprise to me. I had no idea they were doing that. I didn't provide any plans for that. That's just Michael Pickwood and Matt Sanders and the rest of the guys accessorizing the TARDIS. But that was a treat to see as well. Yeah, the little brass clock was supplied from. It got to them via Clayton Hickman, but Clayton Hickman again took the plans for the little brass clock from the TARDIS builder's site. I think on balance, I'd have preferred it to be green, like the original.
That was going to be my next question, because obviously, as we now know, the set wasn't bright white, was it? I always believed it was bright white, and I only found out a few years ago, or put two and two together. I can't remember what it was. Early John Pertwee episodes, you do see the green console, don't you?
Yeah.
But on screen, if it looks white in a black and white story, it's not unreasonable for us to assume that it was white. But no, it wasn't. And the studio floor was light blue as well, wasn't it? So all those things. But obviously within the fiction, they seem to commit to the idea, the vision in 2017 that what you saw on screen was how it was, rather than how it was actually within the studio parameters within our world.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you, in 1960s, using the camera technology that they had available then, if you painted something, actually had a set that was white, you just get a negative flare on your camera, right? The Dalek extermination effect. Just too much glare for the camera's electrics to cope with. So that's why you have to go for either an off-white or a pale colour to get rid of that flare.
Mm-hmm.
And the metallic hexagon at the base as well, which you don't really see unless you're looking for it, Sarah, when you watch those early episodes.
You don't know, but it's all there, and the amount of detail, it's breathtaking. And again, you do have to kind of watch it over and over again.
And it's just lovely to see roundels, all Doctor Who fans are fans of roundels.
Yes.
That console room for me, and we've talked about this many, many times on the show, and that console room for me remains the best console room, bar none. To me, it knocks all of the post-2005 console rooms out of the water. I understand why there's fans of those, 100%. I do understand, especially, Sarah, people like yourself who came onto Doctor Who with those sort of 2005 and later console rooms. But for me, as a fan of the 70s Doctor Who onwards, this is always and always will be the console room, and I'd just give anything to them to go back. So that console room, that's all I need. Do you feel the same, Tony, or do you?
Original is best. Original is best.
There's a strong argument to say that all the component parts, everything that you need to evoke that ship, that environment, are all there, and it doesn't really matter how you want to design it or redesign it for modern times, which sort of fad you want to go with to include, or which other movie or TV franchise you think, oh, I like how they did that on that show or film. Maybe we could incorporate that, a hologram or something, or something that looks like touch sensitive. Any one of these things, but everything is actually there. And this show, even now, even in 2023 and onwards into the all-new era, the show itself would work just as well if there was a set just like this. Within reason. Within reason.
It would. I can't argue with that. And, like Simon says, I love most of the consoles in the 2000s, but yeah, there is something just so... I know we keep going back to that word, but it's iconic. And it's... we wouldn't have these other console rooms had it not been, for the success of this design. This is the blueprint.
Yep.
Well, firstly, it's timeless, and secondly, it truly is a classic design. As Tony said earlier on, there's been nothing like it before or since. It just broke the mold with this. There's no two ways about it. It's a beautiful design.
I'm in awe of yourself, Tony, for your dedication to drawing up those plans, to sourcing that information, to getting your head around the practicalities of building something like this in the first place, let alone recreating it now. I'm a creative, a career creative, whatever you want to call it, and that's sort of my skill set. But I am in awe of anybody with the multitude of practical skills that can take ideas, dreams, flights of fancy, and turn them into things that people can walk around, push buttons on, and I suppose dismantle at the end of the day. Things that are practical working props that look as beautiful as this, and to keep it running and to make it function in creating the magic for us that we are going off into time and space, and to make this sort of technology kind of feasible with all its whizzes and pops and anything, even if it's a bit Heath Robinson, I think that's uniquely British, and I think it's very, very Doctor Who. And I'm sort of coming around to your way of thinking, Simon, actually, that let's just go back to this. As excited as I am to see what's coming next, I've been won over in the course of this conversation. Perhaps the dial really does need to go
Simon. We've
all the way
converted
back. Yeah. So much magic happened with Doctor Who, of course, it did back in 1963, 60 years ago this month. And when the show started to take flight, it would make stars of Carol Ann Ford, Jacqueline Hill, and William Russell, who I know they'd all done lots of things before, but it turned them into proper stars. And of course, gave William Hartnell, ironically, the role of his lifetime, a man who'd had success after success too, and birthed the entire series that we're sat here talking about today. An Unearthly Child was obviously screened on the 23rd of November, 1963, and it's been viewed. I've watched this thing dozens and dozens of times, and as you say, Simon, I don't think I'd ever really sat and clocked quite how much of the screen time did take place on that set, and what that must have taken, how important it was. And so for them to have taken the time that they did, and for it to go backwards and forwards and in and out of different designers' hands, I can imagine it was probably a bit of a trial at the time. I was going to say ball ache, but I didn't. A bit of a trial, a bit of a trial at the time. But the end result is a concept, a design, which in all reality has lasted for 60 years. Everything, kind of like the frameworks that you were talking about earlier on there, Tony. The framework is sort of still there. And any time that any designers that come to the show in the decades afterwards, if they move everything out of orientation that bit too much, even if there's a central console there, it doesn't look like the TARDIS anymore. It doesn't look like the same place anymore. There's only so far you can push it. And I think that's probably the strength of the original designers of Barry Newbury, Peter Brahatchke, all those people. and I suppose the people as well through the remainder of the classic run, Simon. I know that we can't over romanticize this too much. A lot of the time, the thing was literally just thrown out of store, popped on. They might have given it a fresh coat of white paint on the floor. That was largely it.
And the thing is, as you go through the sort of 70s and the 80s, and obviously they did remake the console room on a number of occasions, and after a while it does begin to look very, very shabby. If you look closely, you can see sort of roundels falling off, or that they're not lit, or whatever it might be. But again, it is down to that elegance of design that it still works. Even when it's beginning to look a little bit worn around the edges, it still works, doesn't it, Tony? Somehow you don't notice it.
Well, I do, but
you're looking with a picky eye.
Yeah.
But that's just me. That's just my I can see how you've made.
But
that,
you can at
mate.
least look through it.
I know how you built it. I agree with what you guys have just said. You can't stray too far from the original. You just can't. You've got to have a 6-sided console with a glass column, and you've got to have roundels, and you've got to have a police box, haven't you?
You've definitely got to have roundels.
Yeah.
As long as you've got roundels and the police box, all is right with the world. All is right with the Whoniverse. We are about to see a brand new interior of the TARDIS on screen for the first time in a few years, but with the increase in budget and the new filming techniques as well, Simon, that we're promised are coming. Well, you can see with the trailers that they're definitely on the way and in place for all new Doctor Who going forward. I can imagine, Tony, you'll be watching just as eagerly as ever with an eye for any little thing that they may have not exactly got wrong, but for anything for any dinks or creases that are there in the old girl. But for 60 years, I think she's looking pretty good, Sarah.
Oh yeah, I agree. She's aging beautifully, like a fine wine. That's what she is.
Excellent. Nice way to describe it, that, like a fine wine. Yes. Just keep it in the bottle.
Doctor Who returns to screen Saturday the 25th of November 2023 at 6:30 p.m. on BBC One with the Starbeast. Stars Catherine Tate, David Tennant, and the TARDIS, the first of that 3-part anniversary event series. And viewers internationally, they can stream it on Disney Plus 2. Look out for more of our anniversary coverage, including reviews of every episode here on Type 40. But that is the old girl starting up and calling time on this edition of Type 40, a Doctor Who podcast. I'll be back with another one soon. Look out for that wherever you found this. It could have been over at the dedicated home feed for Type 40 at type40.podbean.com, or maybe we rolled up on the podcatcher of your choice. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Tuning, all those places. We're on the Podbean app itself, so easily used, and we're so easy to find. We're also on YouTube, the world's largest streaming platform, here on the Type 40 channel, with dedicated video editions of every single podcast now, along with our sister show, Type 40 Live, our weekly magazine format, Doctor Who live stream, completely raw, completely live, where anything can happen, anything can be said, and often is. Get all of that over at the Type 40 channel on YouTube. We're still on the fabulous Fandom Podcast Network's own master feed. Of course we are, loaded up with so many other treats for your ears. Never mind weekly. They're coming at you on the daily. So please consider a trip sideways in time for more quality shows for the FPN. Maybe you'd like to have your say about all of this. You can do that through our social medias, Instagram and X at Type 40 Doctor Who, or you can email us type40doctorwho@outlook.com. And if you're feeling really brave and fancy some real-time extra dimensional banter and chit chat, step into the Type 40 Facebook group. Classic fans and new fans all hanging out there, and we're all looking into the future with all new Doctor Who, the 60th anniversary and beyond. Sarah, where can people find you on social media at the moment? What are you doing and where are you doing it?
Oh, you can find me on, it's not Twitter anymore, is it? It's X, I keep forgetting.
That's
you
the
can
one.
find me at Starry-Eyed Who, just below my name there. I'm also on Facebook. And you can find me on Type 40 on Thursday. Yeah, so come and chat and enjoy.
How about you, Simon?
Yeah, people can come find me on the Whonitics page on Facebook. That's the only place it exists. I can't be bothered with any of the others. So Facebook is quite enough. So come and say hello on the Whonitics page there. And like Sarah, find me on the Thursday on Type 40 Live.
And you can find me at Instagram and X as the Spacebook, wheezing and groaning, ranting and raving, just like the TARDIS, about all things geeky inside and outside of the Whoniverse in TV, comic books, and movies, and whatever else catches my eye, my imagination, or both. Tony, fabulous to have you here in our time-space capsule. So you mentioned the TARDIS Builders Facebook group there. Is that where people can find you, can hang out with you and learn more about what you do?
I tend to just stick to Type 40 Facebook group at the moment.
Sensible man.
Good man.
He
If
got
anybody
taste,
wants to get in touch with me there, by all means, they can do. I'm absolutely always open to sharing stuff that I've got. I'm not one of these people that believes in hoarding stuff and keeping it back. You know, if I've got it, I'll share it.
Fair enough.
There you go. Fantastic stuff. Well, we hope to bring you back on at some point, maybe have another deep dive discussion on the TARDIS, because I know there's a lot of things, lots of points about the TARDIS's history on screen that you could probably talk for hours and hours about, couldn't you?
I could probably bore the pants off you for hours.
Never.
Good man. Thank you very much for your company, Tony. And as always, thanks to you for listening. At long last, we've arrived at the 60th anniversary of Doctor Who. So yeah, keep following, keep listening for more special celebratory coverage from us here at Type 40 and Type 40 Live. There's going to be a lot to talk about, and we'll have the time if you have the space.